They didn't say it to my face. That's the part I keep coming back to. They never do. It was a Tuesday morning when the stroke took me down in the backyard. I'd been deadheading the roses. The pale yellow climbers my husband planted the spring before he died. When something shifted behind my left eye, sharp and wrong, like a switch thrown in a dark room. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground with my cheek pressed against the warm flagstone, and the garden hose still running somewhere nearby. They tell me the neighbor found me. 40 minutes later, according to the hospital report, she heard the hose and thought it was strange. I owe her everything, though I've never been able to tell her that without my voice breaking. The doctor said I had an 8% chance of meaningful recovery in the first 48 hours. I don't remember the ICU. I don't remember the machines, the tubes, the faces peering over me. What I remember is silence, and then, eventually, a thin gray light pressing through my eyelids and a voice saying my name. My son was in the waiting room when I woke. I was told he'd been there on and off, checking in, which is how he later framed it. Checking in, as though I were a package awaiting delivery. But there was something I wasn't supposed to know about those 9 days. I found out the way I found out most things in that hospital, by being quiet enough that people forgot I was awake. A young nurse, blonde, maybe 25, kind in that efficient way young medical people learn early, had left her tablet on the rolling cart beside my bed while she stepped into the hallway to take a call. The screen lit up with a notification, a text thread. My son's name at the top. I could see only the preview before the screen dimmed, but it was enough. Realtor says we can list as early as next week. Need the code for the financial accounts. She's not going to. The screen went dark. I lay there with a blood pressure cuff on my arm and tubes in both hands, and I read those words again in my mind. Realtor. List. Financial accounts. She's not going to. She's not going to what? She's not going to make it. And so they were already moving. That was the morning everything changed. Not the stroke. The stroke was just biology. It was that text that rearranged something permanent inside me. My son is 51 years old. I raised him alone after his father left when he was 9. I worked 2 jobs for 4 years so he could stay in the same school district, so his life wouldn't fracture more than it already had. I drove him to every baseball practice, co-signed his first car loan, helped with the down payment on the house he lives in now. When he married, I welcomed his wife into my home and never once made her feel like a guest. I bit my tongue so many times over the years that I'm surprised there's any left. But I had also watched, over time, how my son looked at my house, at my savings, at the retirement I'd built so carefully, so slowly, the way you build anything alone, brick by brick, year by year, without anyone noticing because no one was looking. I hadn't wanted to see it, so I didn't. Until 9 days in a hospital bed showed me exactly what I'd been refusing to look at. My daughter-in-law came to visit on day 11, after I'd been moved out of the ICU and into a step-down room. She brought flowers, carnations, the cheap kind from the hospital gift shop, and held them at an angle that suggested she didn't want to get too close to the bed. She asked me how I was feeling. I said tired. She said I looked better than expected. I said thank you. We spoke for 12 minutes. She left. She never mentioned the house. Quinn came the next day. My granddaughter. She is 20 years old and she has her grandfather's eyes. Gray-green, a little too serious, and she still hugs me like she means it. She sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand and didn't say anything for a long time, which is the most honest response to almost dying that I've ever encountered. I was scared, she finally said. I know, sweetheart. Nobody called me until the second day. She said it quietly. Not an accusation, a fact. I filed that away. Quinn didn't know about the realtor. I could tell by the way she talked about coming to visit me at home once I was discharged. About sitting on the back porch like we used to. About making her grandmother's chicken soup recipe because she'd finally learned not to burn the onions. She talked about my house like it was still mine. She didn't know it had already been photographed for a listing. I didn't tell her, not yet. The rehabilitation center smelled like industrial cleaner and someone else's lunch. I stayed there for 6 weeks. I didn't tell anyone how quickly I was improving. Not because I was being deceptive, exactly. More because I needed the time. I needed to be somewhere quiet while I thought. I needed to understand what I was going to do next before I let anyone know I had the capacity to do anything at all. My attorney came to see me at the end of the third week. Nolan has handled my affairs for nearly 15 years. He's a careful man, the kind who double reads every document and never raises his voice, which is exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when the world has gone sideways. He sat down across from me and said, "I've been waiting for your call." "You knew?" "I knew something was happening. Your son contacted my office twice while you were in the ICU. Said he was reaching out on your behalf. I told him I would need your direct authorization before discussing anything. He has power of attorney. He had power of attorney while you were incapacitated. The moment you regained legal capacity, it became inactive." He paused. He may not have known that. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, what did he want to know? The location of your investment accounts, the status of your life insurance. He looked at me over his glasses. He asked if there was a second policy. Of course he did, because there was. A small whole life policy I'd taken out in 1987, on the advice of a woman at my credit union who turned out to be exactly right. By now it was worth $412,000. I had never mentioned it to my son, not because I was hiding it, but because it had simply never come up. I'd assumed it would sort itself out when the time came. I'd been wrong about what the time would look like. He doesn't know about it, I said. I didn't confirm or deny anything. Nolan folded his hands on his knee. I think you should tell me what you'd like to do. I looked out the window at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into the back of a minivan. She had a toddler on her hip and a bag in each hand, and she still managed to look like she had everything under control. I want to change the beneficiary on that policy, I said, and I want to talk about a trust. He nodded once. For Quinn? Yes. And your son? I took a slow breath. Nolan, my son spent 9 days deciding what to do with my life before I had a chance to decide for myself. I think that tells me everything I need to know about his role in what comes next. Nolan didn't argue. He just opened his legal pad. The house listing had gone up on day 8. I found out through Quinn, though she didn't know she was showing it to me. She'd mentioned, offhand, during one of her visits, that she'd seen something strange. A listing for a house that looked exactly like mine, same address, same photos of the kitchen, with the green tiles. She always said looked dated but never said it unkindly. She'd thought it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Charming and full of potential, the listing read. Classic bones with room to modernize. Classic bones. I had refinished those floors myself after my husband died. I had replastered that kitchen ceiling after the pipe burst in the winter of 2003. I had planted the dogwood in the front yard the spring my granddaughter was born and watched it come back every April without fail. Those weren't bones. That was a life. And it was for sale before I was even in the ground. I asked Nolan to look into the timeline. He came back to me with what I already suspected. My son had called a real estate agent on day 4. The photos were taken on day 6. The listing went live on day 8. I was still unconscious on day 8. My prognosis was still uncertain. He hadn't waited to grieve. He hadn't waited to hope. He had simply moved. That night, alone in the rehabilitation center, with the lights out, and the hall noise muffled behind my closed door, I thought about the summer my son was 12 and broke his arm at the lake. I drove 90 minutes to the hospital in the dark because I was all he had. I held his hand through the setting of the bone. He cried, and I didn't look away, and afterward he told me I was the only person who ever made him feel safe. Where had that boy gone? I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them. 18. Counted again. 18. I wasn't crying, I was making a list. I was discharged on a Thursday in October. I did not go home. The listing was still active, though the sale hadn't closed. I rented a furnished apartment in a town 40 minutes away and told no one except Nolan and Quinn. Quinn came to help me move in. She didn't ask questions. She brought boxes of pantry staples and a ceramic planter she'd painted herself when she was 14. A gift she'd given me years ago that I'd kept on my windowsills beside the kitchen sink. She'd gone back to the house and retrieved it before her father could clear the place out. I don't know how she knew to do that. Maybe she just knew. He's going to find out eventually, she said. unpacking canned goods into the small kitchen cabinet. I know. What do you want me to say if he asks where you are? That I'm recovering, which is true. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he told me you probably wouldn't come back the same. That people your age, after a stroke, usually, she stopped. He was already talking like you were already gone. When was this? Day 3. I set down the dish I was holding and looked at my granddaughter. She was staring into the cabinet. Her shoulders were tight. Quinn. I didn't know about the house until last week, she said. I want you to know that I didn't know. I know you didn't. She turned around. Her eyes were wet. He's my dad. I know that too. We stood there in that small kitchen for a while, not talking, just letting it be what it was. I saw my son for the first time 2 weeks after I was discharged. Not to speak to him. I wasn't ready for that. I just needed to see him, to look at the version of him that had existed while I was unconscious. He had coffee at a cafe near his office most mornings around 8:30. I knew this because he'd told me once, months ago, during one of our occasional Sunday phone calls that had grown shorter and more obligatory with each passing year. I sat in a corner booth with a newspaper and a cup of tea, and I watched him walk in, order, sit at the window with his phone. He looked fine, well rested. He was wearing the jacket I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years ago. He answered emails. He laughed at something on the screen. He refilled his coffee without looking up. He looked like a man with nothing weighing on him. That, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. On the drive back to the apartment, I called Nolan. Move forward, I said. All of it. The changes took 3 weeks to finalize. The life insurance beneficiary was amended to name Quinn directly, with a structured payout upon her 25th birthday. The second policy, the one my son had been asking about, was redirected to a fund I was establishing with Nolan's help, a small nonprofit to assist women over 60 navigating financial recovery after family crisis or the loss of a spouse. Women who had given everything and found themselves with nothing when they needed it most. There was also the matter of my investment accounts. My son didn't know the full amount. I'd never shown him statements, never mentioned the name of the firm. I had simply been careful, for decades, without making a production of it. Careful the way women of my generation learned to be careful, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone telling us we were doing something remarkable. He had made his calculations based on what he could see. He didn't know what he couldn't, and he had moved fast on incomplete information, the way people move when they're more interested in the outcome than the truth. I showed up at his office on a Wednesday morning. His assistant tried to explain that my son was in a meeting. I said I would wait. He made a call. I heard my son's voice in the background, impatient, and then suddenly, distinctly silent. He came out of the conference room, still holding a folder. When he saw me, the color left his face. Mom, just that, like the word had been startled out of him. Hello, I said. He looked around at his assistant, at a colleague passing through the hallway, and then ushered me into his office and closed the door. He sat behind his desk. I sat across from it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. When were you discharged? He finally asked. A few weeks ago. Why didn't you call? I looked at him. That's an interesting first question. He shifted in his chair. I was going to visit. I just needed to get some things sorted first. What things? Silence. The house, I offered. The accounts, the listing that went live on day 8. His jaw tightened. I had power of attorney. I was acting in your best interest. The doctors said I had a 40% chance of meaningful recovery by day 5. I know what they said. I was there when they repeated it to me after I woke up. You were barely conscious. I was conscious enough to notice that you hadn't come by in 4 days. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. I didn't raise my voice. I had thought about this moment for weeks, imagined it loud, imagined it tearful, imagined myself saying all the things I'd stored up over years of being treated like a resource instead of a person. But sitting here, looking at my son in his office with his family photo on the desk and his coffee going cold in the corner, I found I didn't want any of that. I just wanted him to hear me, once clearly without any door to hide behind. You moved the instant the doctors gave you an opening, I said. Not because you were scared. Because you were ready. There's a difference between those two things. His eyes dropped to the desk. The house was already yours in your head before I was off the operating table. I paused. When did it start? Before the stroke or after? He didn't answer. I'm not going to yell, I told him. I'm not here to make a scene. But I need you to understand what you did. You took 9 days while I was unconscious and fighting to stay alive, and you spent them calculating. You called a realtor. You contacted my financial advisor. You asked Nolan about policies you'd never known existed. I folded my hands in my lap. You didn't call your daughter until day 2. He flinched. Quinn, I said, your own daughter didn't find out her grandmother had a stroke until the 2nd day. Because you didn't want to worry her. I let that sit. She's 20 years old. She deserved to be worried. She deserved to be there. He looked at the window. Not through it, just at it, like he needed something between himself and the room. This isn't the conversation where I forgive you, I said. I don't know if that conversation ever comes, or what it would need to look like. But I need you to sit with what you chose during those 9 days. Because I have been sitting with it for 6 weeks, and it has not gotten lighter. I stood and picked up my coat. Mom, his voice cracked just slightly. The listing, I already pulled it. I called the realtor the day after you came home. I told her. I know, I said. Nolan told me. Thank you. I moved toward the door. You should also know that I've made changes to my estate. You'll be hearing from Nolan's office. There's nothing to contest. Everything was executed while I was in full legal capacity, which is straightforward to verify. He said nothing. Take care of yourself, I said. And I meant it in the way you mean things when the love hasn't gone but its shape has changed permanently. I had loved my son for 51 years. I still did. But love and trust are not the same thing, and I understood now, in my bones, that I had been confusing them for a very long time. Quinn and I met for lunch the following Saturday. A diner near the college, vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that came with a refill, and no questions asked. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her textbook open and her glasses on and her hair escaping from the clip she never quite secured properly. She looked up when I sat down, just looked for a moment, then she said, "You saw him. How did you know?" "Because you look like you've set something down." I laughed, a real one which surprised me a little. We ordered. She had the club sandwich. I had soup and half a grilled cheese, which is the same thing I ordered at diners when I was 8 years old, and it always tastes exactly right. "Is it bad?" she asked. "Between you and him?" "It's honest," I said, which means yes, for now. She nodded slowly. "He called me last night. He wouldn't say what you'd talked about, but he said he'd made mistakes." That surprised me. I didn't say so. "Did he mean it, do you think?" she asked. "I think he meant it in the way people mean things when the consequences have already found them." I looked at her. Time will tell. She pushed a French fry around her plate. "I still have to figure out what to do with all of it. He's still my dad." "I know. And whatever he did to me doesn't change what he's been to you. That's yours to work through, Quinn, not mine to decide." She looked relieved, in the way people look when you give them permission to feel something complicated without having to choose a side. We ate in the comfortable quiet we'd always been good at. After a while, she reached into her bag and slid something across the table. The ceramic planter, small, lopsided, painted in blues and greens with a flower on one side, that she'd spent 3 sessions getting right at 14 and still wasn't happy with. "You already gave it back to me," I said. "I know. I just wanted to see you hold it again." I held it. Outside, the October light was doing that particular afternoon thing, low and warm. The kind that makes everything look a little more like itself. I thought about the dogwood in my old front yard, probably past its peak by now, dropping leaves no one would rake. Some things you let go. Not because they don't matter, but because you've finally understood what you were meant to carry. Nolan and I finished the paperwork the following week. The trust for Quinn, the nonprofit documentation, the updated directives. I signed my name to each page without hesitation, not because I wasn't moved. I was, But because I had spent 6 weeks grieving the version of my life I'd expected, and I was through with that now, there was something clean about knowing exactly where everything stood. At the end of our meeting, Nolan said, "You should know you're one of the most prepared clients I've ever had." I had 67 years to practice, I said. He smiled then more quietly. "Are you doing all right, really?" I thought about it honestly, the way I'd been trying to do most things lately. "I'm doing truthfully," I said, "which I think is better than all right." On the walk back to my car, I stopped at a small flower shop I'd never noticed before on that block. In the window was a pot of yellow climbing vine, not roses, something simpler, something I didn't know the name of yet, and I stood there for a moment just looking at it. I went inside. I bought it. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a plant for a new windowsill, in an apartment that was starting, slowly, to feel like somewhere I'd chosen rather than somewhere I'd landed. Quinn called that evening while I was making dinner. "How did it go with Nolan?" "Clean," I said. "Good." A pause, the comfortable kind that doesn't need filling. I tried the soup again, the chicken one. "The onions?" "Better, not perfect." "That's all cooking is," I told her. "Better, not perfect every time." She laughed softly. Outside, the evening was coming in early the way it does in October, but the kitchen light was on, and the new plant was on the windowsill, and my granddaughter was on the phone, and I thought, this is what you come back for. Not the house, not the accounts, not the satisfaction of watching things fall into their rightful place. This, the ordinary, irreplaceable, completely unglamorous fact of being here. Of still being here.